The crimson stain on the pristine white sheets was small, almost insignificant, but it might as well have been a siren screaming. Mason froze, rooted to the plush carpet at the foot of the king-sized bed. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were wide with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. 8 hours. We had been married for precisely 8 hours. The wedding itself had been a carefully orchestrated affair, small but undeniably elegant, mirroring every clause of the contract I'd signed 2 months prior. A business arrangement, he'd called it, a mutually beneficial pact devoid of sentimentality. He needed a wife to polish his image, to appease societal expectations and meddling family members. I needed a mountain of money to throw at the rapidly approaching expiration date on my mother's life. It was a clean transaction, a soulless exchange, or so I thought. But here we were, in the muted, expensive light of the hotel suite's master bedroom. Mason Reed, the billionaire tech mogul, the notorious playboy whose conquests were fodder for gossip columns, my legal husband, was staring at me with an unreadable expression. "You were a virgin," he stated, the words hanging in the air like a fragile ornament. It wasn't a question, but a statement of undeniable fact. I instinctively tugged the silk sheet higher, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable despite the lavish nightgown he'd purchased, or rather, his assistant had purchased, for me. "Does it matter?" I asked, striving for a casual tone that completely eluded me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat I was certain he could hear. He raked a hand through his impeccably styled dark hair, a gesture that seemed almost violent in its disruption of his carefully constructed facade. "It wasn't in the contract," he finally said, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. "No," I agreed, the word barely a whisper. "It wasn't. What I didn't say was that I hadn't thought it would matter. That I'd naively assumed our interactions would be purely transactional, devoid of any real intimacy, emotional or otherwise. What I didn't say was that the intensity of his gaze terrified me. Not because it was laced with anger or contempt, but because, for the first time since I'd met Mason Reed, he was looking at me like I was an intricate puzzle he was determined to solve. I couldn't possibly have known then how that seemingly insignificant detail would unravel everything we thought we knew about each other. I had no inkling that the man who had married me on paper would begin to crave a genuine connection, a real marriage in every sense of the word. That beneath the layers of carefully crafted cynicism and calculated indifference lay a heart capable of a love so profound it would rewrite both of our stories. My name is Ellie Parker, and this is the story of how I accidentally made a billionaire fall in love with me. 2 months prior, I was drowning. Not in a literal sense, of course, but in a sea of medical bills, relentless calls from debt collectors, and the constant, gnawing fear that I was losing my mother. The experimental treatment she desperately needed wasn't covered by our pathetic excuse for insurance, and at $300,000, it might as well have been $3 million. My minimum wage waitress job was barely keeping our heads above water. I'd been working double shifts at the local diner for months, averaging maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, and still watching the bills pile up like a malevolent Jenga tower threatening to crush us both. My mother, ever selfless, kept begging me to stop, to accept the inevitable. But how could I? She was all I had left in the world. My father had abandoned us when I was 12, and it had been just the two of us ever since, a tight-knit team against the world. It was during one of those soul-crushing double shifts that I first encountered him. The Greasy Spoon Diner, with its cracked vinyl booths and perpetually sticky tables, wasn't exactly a haven for men in bespoke suits and watches that cost more than my yearly rent. Yet, there he was, sitting alone in a corner booth on a particularly dismal Tuesday afternoon, looking utterly out of place and yet, somehow, perfectly at ease. I nearly dumped an entire carafe of coffee down his impeccably tailored suit when I recognized him. Everyone in the city knew who Mason Reed was. His face was plastered across the covers of business magazines and graced the local news on an almost weekly basis. At 34, he'd single-handedly built Reed Technologies from a scrappy startup in his garage to a multi-billion-dollar global powerhouse. He was also infamous for his revolving door of model girlfriends and his steadfast refusal to succumb to the relentless pressure from his traditional family to settle down. "Can I help you?" I managed to ask, my voice a shaky octave higher than usual, pad in hand, trying desperately to project an air of professionalism. He looked up from his phone, and I was immediately struck by the weariness etched around his eyes, a stark contrast to the carefully cultivated image of a man who seemingly had it all. Just coffee? Black, he replied, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. I nodded, relieved to have a simple task to focus on, and turned to leave, but he spoke again, his gaze lingering on my name tag. Actually, Ellie, I'll take the special too, whatever it is. Meatloaf? I told him, unable to resist a small smile. To my surprise, a genuine smile transformed his face, softening the harsh lines and revealing a glimpse of the charismatic man the media raved about. Perfect. When I brought his food, he offered a polite but distracted thank you, then proceeded to completely ignore it. He merely pushed the meatloaf around his plate, his gaze fixed on the rain lashing against the window. I figured he must be having a particularly bad day. Even billionaires weren't immune to those. I dutifully refilled his coffee, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that I was witnessing something more than just a bad mood. As my shift drew to a close, and I braced myself for the start of my second, I was surprised to find him still there. Hours had passed, the rain had subsided, and Mason Reed was nursing his third cup of coffee, his meatloaf cold and untouched. Everything okay with your meal? I asked, emboldened by exhaustion and a desperate need to clear the table. He looked up at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. Do you ever feel trapped, Ellie? Like you've built a life that doesn't fit anymore? It was such an unexpected, oddly personal question that I instinctively answered honestly. All the time. But usually it's because the life got built around me, not by me. Something in my response seemed to genuinely pique his interest. He gestured to the seat across from him. Sit with me for a minute. I glanced towards my manager, who was engrossed in a heated argument with the cook, and then slid into the booth. I have about 3 minutes before my next shift starts. You're working a double? He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. I nodded, unable to muster the energy for a lie. I need the money. For what? Maybe it was his unervingly direct gaze, or maybe it was simply that I was too tired to carry the weight of my burdens alone any longer. But I found myself telling him about my mom, about the experimental treatment, about how I was still $278,000 short with time running out. He listened without interrupting, his face an impassive mask. When I finished, he reached into his pocket, extracted a sleek business card, and scribbled something on the back. Come to this address tomorrow at 10 a.m. He said, sliding the card across the table towards me. I have a proposition for you. I stared at the card, my mind reeling. What kind of proposition? One that could solve both of our problems. He stood up, leaving a generous $100 bill on the table, a sum that could cover a significant chunk of our overdue electricity bill. Don't be late. I should have tossed the card in the trash. I should have recognized the sheer insanity of meeting with a complete stranger, a ridiculously famous stranger, based on a vague, mysterious proposition. But desperation, as they say, makes people do things they never thought themselves capable of. And I was undeniably, irrevocably desperate. That's how I found myself standing in the opulent lobby of the Reed Technologies building the next morning, being escorted to the top floor by a security guard who surveyed my worn jeans and thrift store jacket with barely concealed disdain. Mason's office was exactly what you'd expect from a tech billionaire. Minimalist, all glass and steel, with a panoramic view of the city that made it look like a perfectly rendered miniature. He was on the phone when I arrived but gestured for me to sit in one of the sleek, uncomfortable chairs facing his massive desk. I don't care what the board thinks. He barked into the phone, his voice sharp and commanding. I'm not selling to Harris. Find another solution. He slammed the phone down without so much as a goodbye and turned his full attention to me. You came, he said, a flicker of something that might have been pleased surprise in his eyes. You said you had a proposition that could help my mom. I retorted, my voice sharper than I intended. I'd walk into a volcano if it meant saving her. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze intense and unsettling. That's exactly why I think this could work. What could work? Instead of answering directly, he rose from his chair and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to me. My grandfather built Reed Industries from nothing. When he died 5 years ago, he left conditions in his will regarding the company leadership. Conditions I've been ignoring. I waited, my confusion mounting. I couldn't fathom what any of this had to do with me. The company bylaws state that the CEO must be married by the age of 35 to maintain controlling interest. My birthday is in 3 months. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. My grandfather believed family men make better leaders, more stable, more trustworthy. And you're not planning to get married? I ventured, finally beginning to grasp the direction of this bizarre conversation. Not in the traditional sense. No. He returned to his desk and sat down, his movements precise and controlled. Marriage complicates things. Emotions complicate things. But losing control of my company to my cousin Richard would be even more complicated. I was starting to understand where this was going, but the sheer audacity of it all still felt too ridiculous to be real. I need a wife, Ellie, on paper, he stated bluntly. Someone who can attend functions, be photographed at charity events, and give the appearance of a stable home life. In return, I'll provide financial compensation that would more than cover your mother's treatment and ongoing care. My mouth went dry, my heart pounding in my chest. You're offering to pay me to marry you? I'm offering a business arrangement. A contract marriage? He corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. 1 year minimum, with the option to extend if the arrangement works for both parties. At the end, we divorce amicably, and you receive an additional settlement. He slid a thick folder across the desk towards me. Inside was a document that resembled a prenuptial agreement on steroids, outlining every conceivable detail of our potential arrangement. Financial terms, expectations of behavior, even a meticulously planned schedule of public appearances we would be required to make as a couple. $300,000 upfront, he said, pointing to a figure that made my eyes widen in disbelief. Plus living expenses, clothing allowance, and a monthly stipend. After 1 year, an additional $500,000 as a divorce settlement. It was more money than I could possibly imagine. Enough to not only save my mother's life but also set us both up comfortably for years to come. Why me? I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. You could hire an actress or a model, someone who knows how to navigate your world. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Because when you told me about your mother yesterday, you were genuine. This arrangement requires someone who can be trusted to honor a contract. Someone with a strong motivation to make it work, and someone who won't develop emotional complications. How do you know I won't? His smile was confident, almost arrogant. I'm not an easy man to love, Ellie. Just ask any of my exes. I looked down at the contract again, the numbers swimming before my eyes. All that money, my mother's life hanging in the balance. We would have to... I couldn't bring myself to say it. Sleep together? He shook his head, his expression dismissive. Not required. The contract specifies separate bedrooms. This is a business arrangement, not a romance. A business arrangement. A way to save my mom. A year of my life in exchange for her having many more. When would we need to get married? My voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. 2 weeks from now. Small ceremony followed by a more public reception. I have a team that can handle all the arrangements. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, I could be Mrs. Mason Reed. The thought was so utterly absurd that I almost laughed. I need time to think, I said, standing abruptly. He nodded, unsurprised. You have until tomorrow. After that, I'll need to pursue other options. I left his office with the contract tucked into my bag, feeling as though I'd stumbled into someone else's life. By the time I reached the hospital for my daily visit with my mom, I'd almost convinced myself I was going to say no. It was crazy, insane. But then I sat beside her bed, watching her sleep, looking so frail and small against the stark white sheets. The doctor had pulled me aside earlier that week, his expression grave, as he explained that without the treatment, she had at most 6 months left. I took the contract out of my bag and read it again, line by line. It was surprisingly straightforward. Marriage in name only. Public appearances together. Support of each other's goals and interests in public settings, at least outwardly. Separate bedrooms. No romantic entanglements with others during the contract period to avoid scandal. Divorce after a minimum of 1 year, with the option to extend if both parties agreed. My mother woke while I was still reading, her weary eyes finding mine. "What's that, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice weak and raspy. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. Instead, I offered a feeble smile. "Just some paperwork from the hospital. Don't worry about it. You look troubled. Just tired. How are you feeling today?" "Like I'm ready to dance a jig," she joked, then dissolved into a fit of coughing. "Ellie, I need you to listen to me. You have to stop killing yourself trying to save me. It's not what I want." "Mom, no. Listen, you've put your whole life on hold. No college, no dating, just work and hospital visits. That's not living." I took her hand, feeling the fragile bones beneath her thin skin. "I'm not giving up on you." Her eyes filled with tears. "Sometimes loving someone means letting them go." I thought about that all night, about love and sacrifice, about what it truly meant to live. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I dialed the number Mason had given me, my hands trembling slightly. "I'll do it," I said when he answered, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I have conditions of my own." There was a brief pause, a beat of silence that stretched on forever. "I'm listening. The money for my mom's treatment gets paid directly to the hospital immediately, before the wedding. Done. And I want it in writing that I can visit her whenever I need to, regardless of whatever social obligations we have. That's reasonable." I took a deep breath, bracing myself. "And one more thing. When this is over, when we divorce, you don't try to take the money back, no matter what happens." His voice was steady, unwavering, when he replied, "I honor my contracts, Ellie, always." 2 days later, I signed the papers in his lawyer's sterile, impersonal office. 1 week after that, I moved into the guest room of his sprawling penthouse apartment, a space larger than the entire apartment I had shared with my mother. And exactly 14 days after our fateful meeting at the diner, I became Mrs. Mason Reed in a small, sterile civil ceremony, attended only by his lawyer, his assistant, and a photographer who documented the event for a carefully crafted press release. My mother wasn't there. I told her I'd met someone, that it was a whirlwind romance, deliberately omitting any mention of money or contracts. She was skeptical but too weak to question me extensively. I promised to bring my new husband to meet her as soon as she was stronger, after she started the treatment that was now, miraculously, scheduled to begin the following week. The wedding itself was brief and emotionless. Mason was polite but distant, treating the whole thing like a particularly tedious business meeting. I wore a simple white dress his assistant had selected for me, something understated yet undeniably elegant. He wore an impeccably tailored gray suit that probably cost more than all the worldly possessions I'd brought with me to his home. When the judge pronounced us husband and wife, Mason kissed me briefly on the cheek, the first time he'd touched me since our initial meeting. His lips were warm, but his eyes remained cool and assessing. "Congratulations, Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, as we signed the marriage certificate. Phase 1 complete. Phase 1. It was clear this was just another business project for him, which of course it was. The reception was a stark contrast to the somber ceremony. Held at one of the city's most exclusive hotels, it was a glittering affair attended by 200 of Mason's closest business associates, a smattering of local celebrities, and a handful of influential politicians. I was introduced as his new bride, the woman who had finally captured the heart of the city's most eligible bachelor. I smiled until my face ached, laughed at jokes I didn't understand, and clung to Mason's arm as if we were deeply in love. He played his part perfectly, keeping me close, occasionally brushing my hair back from my face or whispering in my ear. Nothing felt real, just empty gestures performed for the benefit of the watching eyes. "You're doing well," he murmured during a brief moment alone, his breath warm against my ear. "They're buying it." "I'm not sure your friend Charles is convinced," I replied, nodding subtly towards a distinguished-looking man who had been observing us with a suspicious intensity all night. Mason's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Charles thinks he knows me better than I know myself. Don't worry about him. But I did worry. I worried about everything. About whether people could see through our elaborate charade. About my mother, alone in the hospital while I played dress-up with the city's elite. About what would happen when the year was over, and I had to go back to my real life, a life that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. By the time we returned to the opulent honeymoon suite Mason had booked for appearance's sake, I was utterly exhausted, both physically and emotionally. All I wanted was to peel off the uncomfortable designer dress and sky-high heels, wash away the layers of professional makeup, and sleep for 12 solid hours. Mason loosened his tie as we entered the suite, heading straight for the well-stocked bar. "Drink?" he offered, pouring himself what looked like a generous measure of aged whiskey. "No, thank you. I think I just need to sleep." He nodded, taking a sip of his drink, his gaze distant. "You were convincing tonight." Several people commented on how happy I looked. "I'm glad," I replied, my voice flat. I shifted awkwardly, suddenly acutely aware that we were alone in a lavish hotel suite on our wedding night, two strangers bound together by a contract. "I'll just go get changed," I mumbled, grabbing the small overnight bag his assistant had packed for me and retreating to the sanctuary of the bathroom. Inside, I found a pristine white silk nightgown with a matching robin's egg blue robe. It wasn't overly revealing, but it was definitely more elegant than the worn t-shirts I usually slept in. I changed quickly, washed my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. Mrs. Mason Reed. The name felt foreign on my tongue, like clothes that didn't quite fit. I touched the simple platinum band on my finger, the only piece of jewelry I'd received. No engagement ring. No need for one since there had been no engagement, just a cold, calculated business transaction. When I emerged from the bathroom, Mason had removed his jacket and tie and was sitting on the edge of the massive bed, still nursing his drink. He looked up when I entered, and something flickered across his face, a fleeting expression I couldn't quite decipher, before he quickly masked it with his usual practiced indifference. "The bed is yours," he said, standing abruptly. "I'll take the couch in the sitting room." I frowned, my brow furrowed with concern. "That couch is tiny. You won't sleep well." "I rarely sleep well anyway," he replied, his voice tinged with a weariness that surprised me. He finished his drink and set the glass down on the nightstand with a soft clink. Part of being responsible for thousands of employees and shareholders. It was the first truly personal detail he'd shared since our arrangement began. A glimpse behind the carefully constructed walls he kept so firmly in place. "That sounds lonely," I said without thinking, the words tumbling out before I could censor myself. His expression hardened slightly, the brief moment of vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "It's the price of success." An awkward silence descended, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. I was acutely aware that most newly married couples would be celebrating their union right now, not standing on opposite sides of a room, avoiding eye contact. "We should discuss tomorrow," Mason finally said, breaking the silence. "There's a brunch with my executive team and their spouses. Then we fly to Aspen for a short honeymoon, 3 days, mostly for photos and to establish the narrative." "Aspen," I repeated, the name sounding foreign and exotic on my tongue. "I've never been." "It's nothing special," he said dismissively, his tone laced with a hint of cynicism. "Just trees and rich people pretending to be outdoorsy." His tone was dismissive, but there was something almost defensive in it, too, as if he were trying to downplay the significance of the lavish trip. I sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly feeling the full weight of what I'd agreed to. A year of pretending, a year of photo ops and public performances, a year of living with a virtual stranger who saw me as nothing more than a box to check in his grandfather's archaic will. But then I thought of my mother, and the life-saving treatment that was now within our reach because of this insane arrangement, and I straightened my shoulders, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I'll be ready," I promised, my voice filled with a newfound resolve. Mason nodded, hesitated for a moment, as if he were on the verge of saying something else, then simply said, "Good night, Ellie," before disappearing into the adjoining sitting room. I climbed into the enormous bed, sinking into sheets that probably cost more than a month's rent at my old apartment. Despite my overwhelming exhaustion, sleep eluded me. I kept thinking about Mason, about the loneliness I'd glimpsed beneath his controlled exterior, about the year ahead, and the strange limbo I now existed in, neither truly his wife nor completely separate from him. Eventually, I drifted off, only to be jolted awake several hours later by the sound of the shower running. Morning light filtered through the heavy curtains. I checked my phone and saw that it was just after 7. Far too early after such a late night, but Mason was clearly already up and preparing for the day. I stretched, wincing as my muscles protested the unfamiliar strain of the previous day's activities, and was about to get up when I noticed it. The unmistakable stain on the pristine white sheets. Small, reddish-brown, and impossible to ignore. My period, for days early, undoubtedly triggered by the overwhelming stress of the past few weeks. I felt my face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance. Nothing like starting your fake marriage by bleeding on the ridiculously expensive hotel sheets. I quickly gathered my things, intending to change in the bathroom as soon as Mason was finished, hoping to strip the bed before housekeeping arrived, and jumped to entirely the wrong conclusions. The water shut off, and a few minutes later, Mason emerged from the bathroom with a towel wrapped around his waist, his dark hair still damp. He stopped short when he saw I was awake, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Sorry," he said, his voice roughened by sleep. "I thought you'd sleep longer." I clutched the sheet tighter, suddenly acutely conscious of the thin silk nightgown and the fact that my new husband was standing before me, half-naked and surprisingly muscular for a tech CEO. "It's fine," I managed, my voice a strangled whisper. "It's your room too." He grabbed some clothes from his suitcase and retreated back into the bathroom to dress, leaving me a flustered mess of tangled limbs and racing thoughts. When he emerged again, fully clothed in casual but impeccably stylish weekend wear, I was still sitting in the same spot, unsure of how to handle the increasingly awkward situation. Mason approached the bed, phone in hand. "The brunch is at 11. The car will be here at..." He trailed off, his eyes catching on the small stain I hadn't managed to conceal. There was a moment of stunned silence, broken only by the frantic hammering of my own heart. I watched as he processed what he was seeing, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning understanding. "You were a virgin," he said, the 4 words hanging in the air like a Damoclean sword, poised to sever the fragile threads of our carefully constructed arrangement. And that's where our story really began. After that awkwardly intimate morning revelation, everything shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Mason didn't mention it directly again, but I caught him watching me with a puzzled, almost contemplative expression when he thought I wasn't looking, as if he were trying to reconcile the shy, inexperienced woman he had married with the ruthless businessman he knew himself to be. The brunch with his executive team and their spouses was predictably uncomfortable. I felt like an imposter as the other women discussed vacations in exotic locales I'd only ever dreamed of and casually name-dropped designers whose names I could barely pronounce. Mason stayed close, his hand occasionally resting on the small of my back, guiding me through the maze of stilted conversations with a surprising attentiveness. It was all for show, I reminded myself, just part of the contract. On the private plane to Aspen, as we soared above the clouds towards our sham honeymoon destination, I decided to address the elephant in the room, to break the tension that had been simmering between us since that fateful morning. "About this morning," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "We don't need to discuss it," Mason cut in, his gaze fixed on his laptop screen, his tone dismissive. "I think we do. Clearly surprised you." He closed his laptop with a sigh, his eyes betraying a flicker of annoyance. "It was unexpected. Most women in their mid-20s have more experience." "I know," I finished for him, looking out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below us. "Why didn't you tell me?" I shrugged, feigning indifference. "It wasn't relevant to our arrangement. You said we'd have separate bedrooms. It didn't seem important." "It's not," he agreed quickly, perhaps a little too quickly. I was just surprised. But something had changed. Something had shifted in the delicate balance of our fake marriage. At the luxury cabin in Aspen, a sprawling architectural masterpiece with 7 bedrooms and a steaming hot tub overlooking the snow-capped mountains, Mason was different, less the ruthless businessman, more human. He asked me questions about my life, my interests, things that weren't covered in the fine print of our meticulously crafted contract. Why no relationships? He asked on our second night, as we sat by the crackling fireplace, the silence broken only by the gentle sounds of the snow falling outside. A photographer had spent the day capturing our romantic honeymoon for a series of carefully curated social media posts, designed to solidify the illusion of our perfect, blissful union. I sipped the surprisingly good hot chocolate he'd made, an unexpected domestic talent for a man who likely had a team of personal chefs at his disposal. No time, mostly. After my dad left, Mom had to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. When I was old enough, I started working too. Then she got sick, and everything else just fell away. But surely there were opportunities. He persisted, his gaze intense. You're... He stopped himself abruptly, as if he'd almost revealed something he hadn't intended to. I'm what? His eyes met mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a vulnerability there. A hint of the man beneath the carefully constructed armor. Attractive, smart, he said softly, the compliment catching me completely off guard. You must have had options. In high school, there were a couple of fleeting flirtations, nothing that truly took root. Then, in a community college class, I connected with someone on a deeper level, but my mother's declining health forced me to withdraw. Romance simply wasn't a priority then. So, instead, you married a stranger for money? There was no accusation in his voice, just stark curiosity. I married a stranger to save my mom, I corrected him. The money was merely the catalyst. He gave a slow nod. That kind of devotion is a rare commodity. What about you? I countered, my curiosity piqued. The tabloids suggest you've been linked to half the models in the country, yet you've never committed to anyone. A shadow momentarily darkened his features. Once I was serious. It didn't conclude favorably. What happened? She was infatuated with Mason Reed, the CEO, not Mason Reed, the person. He gazed intently into the crackling fire. Once I recognized that, I resolved that business arrangements were far simpler, cleaner. No one suffers when expectations are transparent from the outset. Is that what defines us? A business arrangement? His gaze locked onto mine, an unreadable quality swirling within them. That's what the contract stipulates. Yet, that night, as we retreated to our respective bedrooms within the vast cabin, I found myself contemplating the man concealed behind the polished businessman facade. I reflected on the tenderness in his eyes when he spoke of loyalty, the pain I glimpsed when he referenced his past heartbreak. Mason Reed possessed depths I hadn't initially fathomed, and that realization held an undercurrent of danger, because complexity equated to unpredictability. Unpredictability equaled risk, and I couldn't afford to jeopardize my mother's future on emotions that had no place in our calculated arrangement. Upon our return from Aspen, reality descended. Mason resumed his demanding work schedule, often departing before I stirred and returning long after I'd retired for the night. I dedicated my days to visiting my mother at the hospital, observing with cautious optimism as the innovative treatment began to yield subtle signs of progress. I also had to acclimate to my novel role as Mrs. Reed. Charity galas demanded attendance. Business dinners required me to smile and nod while feeling utterly out of place, and countless shopping expeditions with the stylist Mason had employed ensured I looked the part. Mason and I developed a routine, much like roommates who occasionally posed together for the cameras. We meticulously maintained appearances in public, his arm casually draped around my waist, my hand resting lightly on his chest, smiles that appeared genuine because we'd both mastered the art of believable fakery. But within the confines of the sprawling penthouse, with its breathtaking views and profound emotional void, we circled each other warily. Conversations revolved around schedules and public appearances. Brief updates on my mother's health. Nothing personal, nothing real until the night everything was upended once more. I'd resided in Mason's home for nearly a month. My mother had completed her initial round of treatment, and the doctors were expressing cautious optimism. I arrived home, emotionally spent but hopeful, only to discover Mason unexpectedly home early, sitting in the darkened living room with a glass of whiskey in hand. "Mason," I flicked on a nearby lamp. "Is everything all right?" He looked up, and I was taken aback by the raw emotion etched across his face. "My cousin, Richard, made his move today, attempted to convince the board that I'm unstable, despite my marriage. He used photos of me from Aspen, claiming I was excessively drinking on my honeymoon. I settled into a seat across from him. That's absurd. You had, what, 2 glasses of wine the entire weekend? 3, plus champagne at dinner." His mouth quirked into a humorless smile. "Apparently, that constitutes evidence of my unsuitability to lead. What happened? Did you manage to quash it?" "I weathered the storm this time, but he won't relent. Richard has coveted control of the company since we were children. He believes it should have rightfully been his father's, then his." I hesitated, then asked, "Is he right?" Mason's eyes snapped to mine. "What? Not about you being unstable," I clarified quickly. "But about the company? Should it have gone to his father?" He remained silent for so long that I wondered if he would answer at all. "My father was the younger son. According to traditional succession, yes, it should have gone to my uncle. However, my grandfather saw something in my father that he didn't see in his firstborn, a vision for the future. When my father perished in the car accident, that vision transferred to me." "How old were you?" 19. Sophomore year of college." He stared into his empty glass. "Grandfather pulled me out, thrust me into the company. Said grief was best managed through purpose. I thought about my own grief when my mother was first diagnosed. How throwing myself into work had served as both an escape and a form of self-punishment. Did it help? It transformed the company into what it is today." Not an answer to my question, I observed mentally. "But did it help you?" His gaze met mine, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed past all his carefully constructed defenses. No, nothing alleviated that pain. Without conscious thought, I reached across and took his hand. It was the first time I'd touched him when there were no cameras present, no audience, just the two of us in the dim light of his living room. His fingers tightened around mine reflexively. "I'm sorry about your father," I said softly. "It was a long time ago. Grief knows no timeline." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. We remained like that, connected by our clasped hands, for several drawn-out moments before he gently withdrew his. "It's late," he said, rising to his feet. "You should get some rest." I nodded, suddenly aware of how close we drifted to something that wasn't outlined in the contract. Something real. "Good night, Mason." He paused at the entrance to the hallway. "Ellie, thank you for listening." Following that night, the dynamic between us subtly shifted. Mason started coming home for dinner more frequently. We established a ritual of watching documentaries together in the evenings. He favored technology and business, while I gravitated towards nature and history. We compromised, alternating selections, occasionally debating the content. I discovered that, despite his wealth, Mason had surprisingly simple tastes. He preferred plain coffee to elaborate lattes, wore the same style of watch his father had gifted him for his 16th birthday despite owning several more extravagant ones, and harbored a secret fondness for cheap pizza from the place around the corner from his office. He learned that I sketched in my free time, just simple drawings, nothing professional, and surprised me with a set of high-quality art supplies to help me pass the time. He inquired about my mother's progress with genuine interest, not merely out of polite obligation. He remembered how I took my tea and ensured my favorite brand was always stocked in the kitchen. None of this was stipulated in the contract. These small acts of kindness, these fleeting glimpses of the man concealed beneath the CEO mask, weren't required by our arrangement, and that made them dangerous, because I was beginning to care about Mason Reed. Not the convenient fiction we presented to the world, but the real person who sometimes laughed at my terrible jokes, and who once spent 3 hours patiently helping me decipher a complex medical journal article about my mother's treatment. The most treacherous moment came 2 months into our marriage, when my mother experienced a sudden and alarming downturn. An infection, the doctor explained, common among patients whose immune systems were compromised by treatment. I received the call during one of Mason's infrequent dinner parties, a gathering of influential investors he'd been planning for weeks. I excused myself to answer the call, then returned to the dining room, pale and visibly shaken. Mason immediately noticed, interrupting his conversation to rush to my side. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. "It's my mom. They're concerned about sepsis. I need to go to the hospital." Without hesitation, he addressed his guests. "I apologize, but we have a family emergency. My assistant will reschedule." Despite their protests and bewildered expressions, he ushered everyone out with practiced efficiency. Within 20 minutes, we were in his car, speeding towards the hospital. "You didn't have to do that," I said, clutching my purse. "Those investors were important. They can wait." His voice was firm as he navigated through the traffic. "Family comes first." Family? The word resonated deeply within me. Mason considered my mother family. Or was he simply playing the role of devoted husband, even when no cameras were trained upon us? At the hospital, he remained by my side through hours of agonizing waiting, brought me coffee when I refused to leave for even a minute, and spoke directly with the doctors, posing pointed questions I was too overwhelmed to articulate. When we finally received news that the antibiotics were proving effective and my mother was stabilizing, I broke down in relief. Without thinking, I turned to Mason, who pulled me against his chest and held me as I wept. "She's going to be okay," he murmured into my hair. "She's as strong as her daughter." I looked up at him, suddenly hyper-aware of our proximity, of his hands on my back, of the warmth emanating from his body. Something shifted in his expression as our eyes met, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me. Instead, he gently brushed a tear from my cheek with his thumb. "Let's get you home. You need rest." That night, as I lay awake in my bed, I confronted an uncomfortable truth. I was developing feelings for my contract husband. Feelings that had no place in our arrangement. Feelings that threatened to complicate everything. I rationalized it as mere gratitude for his kindness during a crisis, the natural consequence of spending time with someone. Simple confusion because our fabricated relationship sometimes felt more authentic than any genuine relationship I'd ever experienced. But deep down, I knew it was more profound than that, and I was utterly unsure of how to navigate it. The following morning, Mason was uncharacteristically distant, reverting to the polished businessman I'd initially encountered. All polite efficiency and carefully maintained boundaries. It was as if the previous night, his comfort, his concern, the shared moment of connection, had never transpired. "I have meetings all day," he said over breakfast, avoiding my gaze. "Don't wait up." And just like that, we were back to our routine, Mason working late, me spending my days at the hospital with my recovering mother, occasional public appearances together where we portrayed the picture-perfect couple for the cameras before retreating to our separate lives at home. But something had irrevocably changed. I sensed it, even if Mason was feigning indifference. I sometimes caught him observing me when he believed I was unaware, his expression thoughtful and conflicted. Occasionally, our hands would brush as we passed each other in the kitchen, and he would recoil as if the contact had burned him. He was battling something, and so was I. Things reached a boiling point 3 months into our marriage, at a gala celebrating Reed Technologies' latest product launch. I'd grown somewhat accustomed to these events, learning how to smile at the appropriate moments, how to deflect personal inquiries, how to be the supportive wife Mason needed for his public image. That night, I wore a dress his stylist had selected, midnight blue, elegant, yet more daring than my usual choices, with a low back that made me feel both sophisticated and slightly vulnerable. Mason's eyes had widened momentarily when I emerged from my room, but he quickly masked his reaction with a polite, "You look nice." The gala itself resembled countless others we'd attended, champagne, networking, Mason charming potential investors while I conversed with their spouses about safe topics like travel and charitable endeavors. I'd become more adept at this performance of belonging in a world so vastly different from the one I'd grown up in. I was engaged in conversation with the wife of one of Mason's board members when I noticed a woman approaching us, statuesque, with the effortless confidence that stems from knowing you're the most striking person in any room. "Ellie, isn't it?" she said, her smile failing to reach her eyes. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Veronica Chambers." I instantly recognized the name. Veronica had been Mason's most significant girlfriend prior to our arrangement, a relationship that had spanned nearly a year and had been heavily chronicled in the tabloids. The one he'd possibly been alluding to when he'd mentioned being hurt. "Nice to meet you," I said, extending my hand, which she shook with perfectly manicured fingers. "I must say, you're not what I envisioned for Mason's wife. He typically prefers, well, women with more experience in certain social circles." Her tone left no doubt that this wasn't a compliment. The board member's wife excused herself, clearly sensing the building tension. "I suppose tastes evolve," I replied, maintaining my practiced smile. Veronica laughed lightly. "Oh, honey, Mason's tastes haven't changed in the 15 years I've known him, which is precisely why this rushed marriage is so intriguing." Before I could retort, I felt an arm encircle my waist. Mason had materialized beside me, his expression pleasant, but his eyes glacial as he regarded Veronica. "Veronica, I wasn't aware you were on the guest list." She leaned in to kiss his cheek. "Charles invited me. You know how close we've always been." I recalled Charles, the friend from our wedding reception who hadn't appeared entirely convinced by our relationship. "How thoughtful of him," Mason said, his voice laced with an edge I rarely detected. "If you'll excuse us, I need to borrow my wife." He steered me away, his hand firm against my back. Once we were out of earshot, I asked, "Who is she to you?" "Really?" Mason's jaw tightened. "Ancient history." It didn't seem that ancient from where I was standing. He sighed, guiding me towards a quieter corner of the ballroom. "Veronica and I dated briefly, about 2 years ago. It didn't work out because she was interested in Mason Reed, the CEO, not Mason Reed, the person." I quoted his words from Aspen back to him. His eyes snapped to mine, surprised. "Yes, actually. She'll likely imply we have a long history. We grew up in the same social circles, dated briefly in college, then reconnected after my last serious relationship ended badly." His voice was clipped, uncomfortable. "It wasn't. It was a mistake. One I rectified." Before I could probe further, Charles appeared, his timing suspiciously convenient. "Mason and the lovely Mrs. Reed." His smile was affable, but his eyes were assessing as they flickered between us. "I hope you don't mind that I invited Veronica. Old friends should stick together, don't you think?" "Old friends respect boundaries, Charles." Mason's tone was a warning. "And respect marriages." Charles raised his eyebrows. "Of course. Speaking of your marriage, I was just telling Veronica how surprising it was. No engagement announcement, no build-up. Just suddenly, Mason Reed is off the market." I felt Mason tense beside me. This was dangerous territory. Our flimsy story about a whirlwind romance was wearing thin, and Charles clearly suspected something amiss. Without conscious thought, I placed my hand on Mason's chest, gazing up at him with a smile I hoped appeared genuine. "Sometimes when you just know, right, darling?" Mason's gaze met mine, and for a fleeting second, I saw something real there, surprise, warmth, and something else I couldn't quite decipher. "Right," he agreed, then bent to press a kiss to my forehead. Our first public display of affection that hadn't been meticulously choreographed beforehand. "When you know." Charles scrutinized us, his expression skeptical but less assured than before. "How romantic." "Well, don't let me interrupt the newlyweds. Mason will catch up on that Beijing deal tomorrow." After he departed, Mason maintained his arm around me, steering me towards the terrace doors. "We need some air," he stated, not as a question. Outside, the night was cool and clear, the city lights sprawling beneath us. We were alone on the terrace, the sounds of the gala muffled behind the closed doors. "I apologize for that," Mason said, loosening his tie slightly. Charles has always enjoyed creating drama. Inviting Veronica was deliberately provocative. Does he know about our arrangement? Mason shook his head. No, but he suspects something. Charles believes he can read people, especially me. Can he? A faint smile touched Mason's lips. Unfortunately, yes. We've been friends since boarding school. He knows when I'm not being genuine. And with me, you're not? The question escaped before I could restrain it. Mason turned to face me fully, his expression complex. That's the problem, Ellie. With you, I'm more genuine than I've been with anyone in a long time. My heart pounded faster at his words, at the intensity in his eyes. I don't understand what that means. He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its perfect styling. It means this arrangement is becoming complicated. Because of Veronica? Because she might expose us? No. His voice was low, almost frustrated. Because when I kissed your forehead in there, it wasn't for show. Because when I hold your hand at these events, it's ceasing to feel like an act halfway through. Because when you were crying at the hospital and I held you, all I wanted. He trailed off abruptly, taking a step back. This isn't what we agreed to. My pulse was racing now. What did you want, Mason? That night at the hospital? He averted his gaze, staring out at the city lights. It doesn't matter. We have a contract. Clear boundaries. Tell me anyway. I insisted, stepping closer to him. His eyes returned to mine, and the raw emotion in them stole my breath. I wanted to kiss you. Not for cameras, not for appearances, just because I wanted to. The admission hung between us, altering everything. I should have retreated. Should have reminded him of our agreement, of the strictly business nature of our relationship. Instead, I heard myself say, "What's stopping you now?" For a moment, he remained motionless, scrutinizing my face as if searching for evidence that I didn't mean it. Then his hand rose to cup my cheek, and he leaned in slowly, affording me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. His lips met mine, gentle at first, tentative. Then, as I responded, the kiss deepened, transforming into something neither of us had foreseen. Something real. When we finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Mason rested his forehead against mine. This complicates everything, he murmured. I know. The contract specifically states. I know what it states. I pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. Do you want to stop? His response was to kiss me again, more urgently this time, his arms encircling me as mine intertwined around his neck. We lingered on that terrace, exploring this uncharted territory between us until a waiter discreetly cleared his throat from the doorway, reminding us that we were still at a public event. Mason drove us home in silence, both lost in contemplation about what had just occurred, what it signified. In the elevator ascending to the penthouse, he maintained a careful distance, though his eyes seldom strayed from mine. Inside the apartment, he finally spoke. We should discuss this. I nodded, slipping off my heels. Yes, we should. The contract was clear, a business arrangement. No emotional entanglements. I remember. He paced across the living room, tension evident in every line of his body. This wasn't supposed to happen. I don't do this, become involved with someone I'm in business with. Is that what I am to you? Business? I asked quietly. He ceased pacing, pivoting to face me. No, that's the problem. You've become more. And that frightens me. Should scare you too. His voice was serious. I'm not good at relationships, Ellie. I've failed at every significant one I've had. My work invariably takes precedence. I'm controlling, demanding, and, according to my last 3 girlfriends, emotionally unavailable. I'm not seeking a relationship, Mason. I'm merely acknowledging that something has shifted between us. He moved closer, halting just short of touching me. What do you want from this? For me, it was a valid question. What did I want? Our contract was unambiguous, marriage in name, only for 1 year, financial compensation, then an amicable divorce. Emotions weren't part of the equation. And yet, here we stood. I don't know, I admitted. I didn't anticipate caring about you. I didn't expect to look forward to our evenings together or to miss you when you work late. I didn't foresee any of this. His expression softened. Neither did I. We stood there, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between us. Finally, Mason reached out, taking my hand. "We have 6 months remaining on our contract," he said. "After that, you're free to leave, to accept the settlement and begin your life anew." That was the agreement. Yes, but what if? He hesitated, appearing uncharacteristically uncertain. What if we utilize that time to ascertain what this is? No pressure, no expectations beyond what's already stipulated in the contract. Just exploration. Exploration, I echoed, of whatever this is between us. His thumb traced circles on my palm, with the understanding that, at the end of the contract period, you still retain the choice to leave. I won't bind you to anything beyond what you initially agreed to. It was a generous proposition, and a surprising one from a man who governed every facet of his life and business with meticulous precision. He was offering me the space to either cultivate feelings or not, with a built-in escape hatch. And if I choose to stay after the year is up? Something akin to hope flickered in his eyes. Then we negotiate new terms as equals. I stepped closer, placing my free hand on his chest. "I believe I'd like that. The exploration part." His smile was more genuine than any I'd witnessed from him in public. "Good." He brought my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to my knuckles, because I'm finding it increasingly difficult to remember that this was intended to be purely business. That night, we still slept in separate bedrooms. Nothing physical had altered in our arrangement, but emotionally, everything was different. We'd acknowledged the connection burgeoning between us, granting it permission to exist. Over the ensuing weeks, our relationship evolved. Subtle touches that weren't for public consumption. His hand briefly covering mine during dinner, my head resting on his shoulder while we watched documentaries. Conversations that delved deeper than schedules and public appearances, encompassing his dreams for the company beyond profit margins, my abandoned aspirations for college, and a career in art therapy. My mother noticed the transformation when Mason began accompanying me to hospital visits regularly, not simply for appearances, but because he genuinely desired to be there. "He's different than I expected," she confided during one visit when Mason had stepped out to take a call. "The way he looks at you. That's not what I imagined from a whirlwind romance." "What do you mean?" She smiled knowingly. "He looks at you as though he's still trying to figure you out, as though you surprise him. That's rare, Ellie. Most people cease looking at their partners that way once the initial excitement fades." I hadn't divulged the truth about our arrangement to her. I couldn't risk it, particularly with her health still fragile, albeit improving. But her observation prompted me to contemplate how Mason and I had commenced as a business transaction, and where we were now in this undefined space between contract and something genuine. The true turning point occurred 4 months into our marriage, 6 months before the contract was slated to expire. Mason had been working late for days, grappling with a crisis at one of his overseas manufacturing plants. When he finally arrived home after midnight on Thursday, I was still awake, sketching in the living room. He appeared exhausted, his tie loosened around his neck, dark circles etched beneath his eyes. Without uttering a word, he sank. He settled beside me on the couch, the weight of his day seeming to pull him down as he leaned his head back, eyes squeezed shut. "That bad, huh?" I ventured, a knot forming in my stomach. "Worse," he murmured, the word heavy with exhaustion. 3,000 jobs are hanging in the balance if we can't untangle these supply chain issues. I carefully placed my sketchbook on the coffee table. "Is there anything I can do to help? Even if it's just to listen?" He opened his eyes, a flicker of surprise momentarily eclipsing the weariness. "You really want to hear about semiconductor supply chains and the labyrinthine world of international shipping regulations?" "I want to hear about what's important to you," I said simply, meeting his gaze. Something shifted in his expression, a subtle softening around the edges. He reached for my hand, his fingers interlacing with mine. "You're important to me, Ellie. More than I anticipated, more than seems logical given the, shall we say, unconventional way this all began. My heart skipped a beat, a warmth spreading through my chest at his unexpected words. "You're important to me, too, Mason." He reached out with his free hand, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the pragmatic businessman in me to remind the hopelessly smitten man that this wasn't part of the meticulously crafted contract. But it just doesn't feel wrong. "Then what does it feel like?" I asked softly, my voice barely a whisper. "Like coming home," he confessed, the vulnerability in his voice catching me off guard, stealing my breath. "Not just to the sterile apartment, but to you." I leaned forward, drawn to him, closing the distance between us. Our kiss was unlike those we'd shared since that night on the terrace, no longer tentative or exploratory, but filled with a quiet certainty, a deepening connection that resonated in my soul. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer as the kiss intensified, a silent promise of something more. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against mine, his grip on my hands still firm. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Not for anything more than sleep. I don't want to be alone." It was such a raw, human request, so starkly different from the controlled, impeccably poised CEO who had coldly proposed our unusual business arrangement. I nodded, my heart aching with a tenderness I hadn't expected. He led me to his bedroom, a space I had only glimpsed before when the door was slightly ajar. Like the rest of the apartment, it was elegantly furnished, but utterly impersonal. No photographs, no mementos, just expensive furniture and a palette of neutral, almost sterile colors. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like a high-end hotel room. We lay down together, still fully clothed, his arms wrapped tightly around me as if he were afraid I might vanish into the night. "I never sleep well," he confessed into the darkness, his voice barely audible. "Not since my father died. Too many thoughts. They just keep swirling." I gently placed my hand over his heart, feeling its steady, reassuring beat beneath my fingertips. "What kind of thoughts, Mason?" "That I'm not doing enough. That I'll somehow lose everything he built, everything he sacrificed for. That I'll ultimately disappoint him wherever he is now." "I think he'd be proud of you," I said softly, my voice filled with conviction. "Not just for the staggering business success, but for the genuine way you care about your employees. Those 3,000 jobs matter to you. That kind of compassion. That truly matters." He was silent for what felt like an eternity, so long that I thought he might have drifted off to sleep. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "No one's ever said that to me before, Ellie." "Said what?" I asked, tilting my head to look at him in the dim light filtering through the curtains. "That my father would be proud of the man, not just the CEO." I smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Well, the man is pretty remarkable, too, you know. Don't sell yourself short." He kissed me then, a kiss that was gentle and sweet, filled with a newfound tenderness. Before pulling me closer, nestling his face in my hair. We drifted off to sleep like that, tangled together, breaking yet another self-imposed boundary in our carefully structured, meticulously planned arrangement. The next morning, I woke to find Mason watching me, his gaze unguarded in a way I had never witnessed before. The vulnerability in his eyes was both startling and incredibly endearing. "Morning," I said, suddenly feeling self-conscious, acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment. "Morning," he replied, a hint of wonder in his voice. I slept through the entire night. First time in, I can't even remember how long." Before I could formulate a response, his phone rang, shattering the fragile peace of the morning. He glanced at the screen and sighed, the lines of exhaustion returning to his face. "It's the factory crisis. I have to take this." As he answered the call, seamlessly sliding back into his CEO persona, his voice becoming clipped and authoritative, I slipped quietly out of bed and headed back to my own room, the echo of the call, and the demands it represented, hanging heavy in the air. Our brief moment of intimacy, of genuine connection, wasn't erased, but the realities of our lives, his all-consuming work, my mother's ongoing treatment, the very contract that still defined our relationship, forcefully reasserted themselves, casting a long shadow. Yet, despite the encroaching realities, something fundamental had shifted between us. The dynamic had irrevocably changed. That night, Mason came to my door, his expression hesitant, almost shy. He asked quietly if I wanted company. We slept together again, just sleeping, finding solace and comfort in each other's presence. A silent acknowledgement of the bond that was forming. It gradually became our new normal. Separate lives during the day, a shared haven of togetherness at night. Physical intimacy developed slowly between us, cautiously, each touch a tentative exploration of uncharted territory. A week after that first night, when we finally made love, it was nothing like our wedding night. There was no awkwardness, no bloodshed, no shock. Instead, it was the natural, almost inevitable progression of growing feelings, of boundaries dissolving as trust and affection deepened. Afterward, lying in his arms, feeling safe and cherished, I finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at me, the question that held the key to our future. What happens when the contract ends, Mason? Really, Ellie? We're going there now? Mason propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me, his expression unreadable. Seriously? I insisted, meeting his gaze. I asked you first. He smiled slightly, a flicker of amusement dancing in his eyes. Fair enough, he conceded. His expression grew thoughtful, his eyes searching mine. The contract stipulates that you receive your settlement, and we part ways amicably. That was the agreement. That was the plan. He paused, taking my hand, and gently tracing patterns on my bare shoulder with his fingertip. And now I'm hoping you might consider a vastly different arrangement. What kind of arrangement? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. The traditional kind, he said, his voice low and earnest. The kind where you stay. Not because of a legal document or a binding agreement, but because you want to. His eyes met mine, vulnerable and achingly honest. Because I want you to stay, Ellie. Not as my contract wife, not as some prearranged business partner, but simply as my wife. My heart felt too big for my chest, threatening to burst. Are you saying? I'm saying I think I'm falling in love with you, he interrupted, the words tumbling out like a dam had broken, like he couldn't hold them back any longer. I know it wasn't supposed to happen. I know it complicates everything, potentially jeopardizes all the initial conditions, but it's the truth. Tears pricked my eyes, blurring my vision. I'm falling in love with you too, Mason. His smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face, radiating pure, unadulterated joy. He kissed me deeply, pulling me close, as if he never wanted to let go. We still have 4 months left on the contract, I reminded him when we finally broke apart, a flicker of uncertainty clouding my happiness. A lot could change in that time. Or we could grow even stronger, he countered, his voice filled with unwavering conviction. Either way, when the time comes, it will be your choice, Ellie. No pressure, no obligations, just what you truly want. What if what I want is you? I asked softly, the words barely audible. His eyes darkened with emotion, a mixture of hope and longing. Then you'll have me, he said, his voice husky. All of me, not just the carefully curated parts one put in a contract. We sealed that promise with another kiss, another joining of bodies and souls that was becoming as natural and essential as breathing. Whatever had begun as a cold, calculated business arrangement had transformed into something neither of us could have predicted, a chance at real, lasting love. The next 4 months passed in a surreal blend of meticulously planned public appearances and stolen moments of intimate connection. To the outside world, we were still the picture-perfect power couple, the tech mogul and his surprising choice of bride. But behind closed doors, in the quiet sanctuary of our shared evenings, we were simply Mason and Ellie, learning each other, building something genuine and lasting from such artificial beginnings. My mother's health improved steadily. By the time our contract's end date loomed on the horizon, she was in remission, with cautiously optimistic prognosis from her doctors about her long-term recovery. She had grown genuinely fond of Mason, who visited her regularly and had personally arranged for the best specialists to monitor her progress. "He loves you, you know," she told me during one visit when Mason had stepped out to bring us coffee. "Really loves you. I can see it in the little things, the way he looks at you." I smiled, no longer needing to feign affection. "I love him too, Mom." "I know," she said, patting my hand. "And I'm so glad. When you first told me about this whirlwind romance, I was worried. I won't lie. But seeing you together, seeing the way you look at each other, that's the real thing, sweetheart." If only she knew just how unreal our real thing had started. Sometimes I considered telling her the truth, revealing the origins of our relationship. But what would be the point? What had begun as a carefully constructed deception had, almost miraculously, become the most profound truth of my life. As the 1-year mark of our marriage approached the date when our contract would officially end, and I would need to make my final, irreversible decision, Mason became increasingly quiet, a subtle tension radiating from him. He didn't pressure me, didn't explicitly ask what I was thinking or feeling, but I could sense his underlying anxiety in the way he held me a little tighter each night, the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. The night before our anniversary, he came home with a small velvet box. "This is for you," he said, placing it on the coffee table between us. "No pressure attached, just something I should have given you a year ago." Inside was an engagement ring, not an ostentatiously large rock, despite his considerable wealth, but an elegantly designed piece with a vintage feel that perfectly matched my taste. A delicate knot design symbolized the intertwining of our lives. "Mason," I began, my voice choked with emotion. "It's not a request, Ellie," he said quickly, his voice laced with anxiety. "Just a symbol, a representation of what I'm offering, what I'm hoping for if you choose to stay." I looked from the ring to his face, seeing the vulnerability and uncertainty etched there. This powerful man who commanded boardrooms and managed billions in assets was genuinely, palpably nervous about my answer. "I made my decision weeks ago, Mason," I told him softly, my voice filled with love and certainty. His body tensed, bracing himself. Instead of answering directly, I picked up the ring and slid it onto my finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been custom-made just for me. "I choose you, Mason," I said, meeting his gaze. "Not the contract, not the settlement, not any financial security. Just you." The relief on his face was palpable, the tension melting away, followed quickly by a wave of pure, unadulterated joy as he pulled me into his arms, holding me close. "I was so afraid you'd walk away," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would I leave?" I asked, tilting my head to look at him. "When everything I want, everything that truly matters, is right here with you." He kissed me then, deeply and passionately, pouring all his love and longing into that one kiss. When we finally separated, breathless and flushed, he said, "I want to do this properly, Ellie. I want to renew our vows, but for real this time. Not for appearances or contractual obligations, but just for us, for the love we share. Would you like that?" I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "I would like that very much." I held him close, his heartbeat steady and reassuring against my ear. Who would have thought, Mason? A contract marriage turning into the real thing. I smiled against his chest, a smile that radiated pure happiness. Sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the best endings. "Not an ending," he corrected gently, pulling back to look at me, his eyes filled with love. "A beginning, Ellie. A real beginning." 1 month later, we renewed our vows in a small, intimate ceremony with only those closest to us present. My mother, looking healthier and more radiant than she had in years. Mason's grandmother, who had welcomed me warmly into the family from day one, and a handful of friends who knew the full, unvarnished truth about how we'd started and were genuinely happy about where we'd ended up. Charles was Mason's best man, admitting with a grin that he had suspected the underlying artifice of our original arrangement all along, but had kept quiet because he had never seen his friend happier, even when it was supposedly all a facade. Even when it was supposed to be fake, it looked more real than any relationship he'd had before. He confided in me during the reception, as Mason and I shared our first dance as a truly, authentically married couple. No contracts, no conditions, just pure, unadulterated love. As we swayed to the music, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us, I reflected on the strange, circuitous journey that had brought us to this moment. How a desperate need for money had led me to sign a contract with a complete stranger. How that stranger had gradually become my friend, my confidant, my lover, my husband in every conceivable sense of the word. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Sterling?" Mason murmured against my hair as we swayed to the music, his voice laced with affection. "About how sometimes the most unlikely stories have the happiest endings," I replied, looking up at him, my eyes shining with love. "And about how inexplicably grateful I am that you found out I was a virgin on our wedding night." He laughed softly, a warm, comforting sound. That was the moment everything irrevocably changed, wasn't it? When I realized there might be more to you, more to us, than what was coldly written in that ridiculous contract. "Thank goodness for unexpected revelations," I murmured, snuggling closer to him. He pulled me even closer, his lips brushing against my ear. "And thank goodness for contract marriages that miraculously turn into real ones." As we danced under the stars, surrounded by people who genuinely cherished us, I knew, with unwavering certainty, that what had started as the most calculated, businesslike of arrangements had been transformed into the most authentic, profound love either of us had ever known. Sometimes the most unexpected beginnings truly do lead to the most beautiful journeys, and ours was just getting started.